When a homeless man approached Karoline Leavitt, asking for just $1, no one expected what would happen next. What started as a simple request would spark a chain of events that would change everything. The city was alive with movement, the hum of traffic, the murmur of hurried conversations, the distant sound of a street performer playing a saxophone. At the corner of 5th Avenue and K Street, a man sat slumped against the wall of an old diner. His clothes were layered, but still not enough to keep out the biting cold. His hair was unkempt, his hands rough and cracked from the wind. Beside him, a cardboard sign lay propped up against his knee. "Anything helps, God bless." His name was Jack. At 46, he had been on the streets for over a year. Bad luck, bad choices, a mix of both had led him here. He had once had a job, a home, a life that felt stable. But life has a way of unraveling faster than you can stitch it back together. Most days, people walked by, barely sparing him a glance. Some dropped a few coins into his empty coffee cup, others quickened their pace, pretending not to see him. He had learned not to expect kindness. It made the absence of it easier to bear. He was staring at the pavement, lost in thought, when he noticed a pair of polished black heels stop just a few feet away from him, not moving, just standing there. Jack hesitated before looking up, his eyes meeting a pair of sharp, calculating ones. The woman was well-dressed, her dark coat fitted neatly around her frame. She looked important, like someone who had places to be, people to meet. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't rushing past, wasn't pretending he didn't exist. She was watching him, studying him with a look that wasn't pity, but something else. Curiosity, maybe quiet consideration. Jack cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Miss," he said, his voice hoarse. "Can you spare $1 for some coffee?" He had asked the question 1,000 times before, expecting the usual quick shake of the head or the empty promise of maybe next time. But what she said next caught him off guard. "What do you need it for?" Her voice was steady, not cold, not dismissive, just direct, like she actually wanted to know. Jack blinked, surprised by the question. He glanced at his sign, as if searching for the right answer, then back at her. "Well, a coffee would be nice. Maybe a sandwich if I can stretch it," he said, forcing a small, tired smile. The woman nodded slightly, then did something Jack didn't expect. She crouched down to his level, right there on the sidewalk, in the middle of the busy city. No one had ever done that before. Usually when people spoke to him, they looked down at him, literally and figuratively. But now here she was meeting him eye to eye. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jack," he said, hesitating for a moment before adding, "And yours?" "Karoline," she replied simply. No arrogance, no airs, just a simple introduction. Jack shifted, unsure of what to make of this. She wasn't handing him money, yet she wasn't walking away either. She was still watching him, like she was thinking through something bigger than this moment. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. Jack exhaled, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Just over a year," he admitted. "Lost my job at the plant. Savings ran out faster than I thought." He looked away, his voice quieter than before. "Once you lose your footing, it's hard to get back up again." Karoline was quiet for a moment, not out of discomfort, but as if weighing his words. She reached into her coat pocket. Jack expected her to pull out a few bills, maybe a couple of ones. But when her hand emerged, she wasn't holding a single dollar. She was holding a crisp $100 bill. Jack's breath hitched. His fingers twitched with hesitation as he stared at the bill. This was more than he had asked for, more than he had hoped for. "Here," she said, offering it to him. "This should cover more than coffee." Jack didn't move at first, his mind trying to process what was happening. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Karoline's expression didn't change. "Because I can," she said simply. "And because everyone deserves a chance." Jack swallowed hard. The words landed deeper than he expected. But before he could reach for the bill, she pulled it back just slightly. "But on one condition." Jack frowned, looking up at her. "What's the catch?" She tilted her head slightly. "No catch. Just a promise. If I help you today, you have to help yourself tomorrow. Deal?" Jack stared at her, his throat tight. No one had ever said anything like that to him before. People had either ignored him or given him charity. But this felt different. Like a challenge, like a test, like she was daring him to believe in himself again. Slowly, he nodded. "Deal," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Karoline handed him the bill, then reached into her bag again, pulling out a small card with an address on it. "Go here tomorrow morning," she said. "It's a shelter, but they also help with jobs, resources, whatever you need. Tell them I sent you." Jack took the card, running his thumb over the embossed letters. He had heard of the place before, always meant to go, but never found the courage. He looked back up at Karoline, something unreadable in his eyes. "And you think they'll actually help me?" Karoline's gaze didn't waver. "They will. But you have to show up." Jack nodded again, gripping the card like it was a lifeline. As Karoline stood, brushing off the city dust from her coat, Jack noticed the crowd that had gathered around them. People whispering, some recording on their phones. He felt a twinge of embarrassment, but Karoline didn't seem to care. She looked at him one last time, her voice firm. "Be there tomorrow. Don't waste this." And then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like she had never been there. But Jack knew this moment wasn't something he would forget. He looked down at the $100 bill, the card in his hand, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, something he thought he had lost a long time ago. Hope. Jack sat there for a long time, staring at the bill in his hands. The card with the address felt heavier than it should, as if it carried more weight than just ink and paper. The city moved around him, people passing, cars honking, conversations blending into the usual background noise. But Jack barely noticed. He was stuck between disbelief and something else, something he hadn't felt in years. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could change. He looked up at the street ahead, watching as Karoline disappeared into the crowd until she was just another figure lost in the rush of the city. For a moment, he wondered if it had really happened, if maybe he had imagined the whole thing. But the crisp bill between his fingers was real, the card in his other hand was real, and the feeling in his chest, that strange mixture of anxiety and hope, that was real too. He folded the bill carefully, slipping it into his pocket, then looked at the address again. He had passed by that shelter before, seen people going in and out, but he had never gone inside. Something about it had always made him hesitate. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear. But tonight would be different. Tonight, he had a reason to go. As the last bit of daylight faded, Jack pulled his coat tighter around himself, the cold settling in for the night. He didn't have a place to sleep, not really. Sometimes he found a spot behind the diner, where the wind wasn't as bad. Sometimes he used one of the old bus stops with the broken benches. Tonight, he thought about finding somewhere nearby to the shelter, somewhere that would make it easier for him to show up in the morning. Because if he didn't go now, if he let another night pass, the fear might creep back in and convince him not to go at all. He stood up slowly, his body stiff from sitting on the cold pavement. The small crowd that had gathered earlier had already dispersed. No one was paying attention anymore. No one was watching him, debating whether or not to take this chance. No one except himself. He walked through the streets, his fingers brushing over the card in his pocket every few minutes, as if to make sure it was still there. He had to go. He had to at least see if this was real, if someone like Karoline Leavitt really meant what she said, if people really did care. The shelter wasn't far, just a few blocks from where he usually stayed, but it felt like a longer walk than it should. He stood outside the entrance for a moment, staring at the doors, light spilling out onto the sidewalk, people coming and going, some with tired faces, some with hopeful ones. He clenched his jaw, forcing his feet to move forward. One step, then another, then finally inside. The warmth hit him immediately, the air thick with the scent of coffee and something cooking. A woman at the front desk looked up, smiling softly as if she already knew why he was there. "Can I help you?" she asked. Jack hesitated, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Karoline sent me. She said you could help." The woman's smile grew a little warmer. "Ah, so you're Jack. We've been expecting you." Expecting him. The words made his chest tighten. He had been alone for so long, had spent so much time being ignored, that the idea of someone expecting him, someone caring enough to follow through on their word, felt almost foreign. "Come on in," the woman said, motioning for him to follow. "We'll get you set up." Jack followed her deeper into the shelter, the hum of conversation around him, people eating, talking, some laughing, others just sitting quietly. He had spent so long on the outside looking in, and now, for the first time in a long time, he was here. Inside, where it was warm, where people spoke to each other, where no one was looking at him like he was invisible. They found him a place to sleep, just a cot, but to Jack, it might as well have been a king-sized bed. For the first time in months, he would sleep with a roof over his head, without worrying about someone trying to steal his things, without the cold creeping into his bones. He laid back, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Karoline Leavitt had meant what she said. She had given him a chance. Now it was up to him to take it. When morning came, Jack woke to the sound of quiet footsteps and the smell of fresh coffee. It took him a moment to remember where he was. For the first time in over a year, he had slept through the night without waking up shivering. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. This was real. After a quick breakfast, one of the staff members led him to a caseworker, a man named Eric. He had kind eyes, the kind that didn't just look at you, but actually saw you. "So Jack," Eric said, flipping open a folder. "Let's start simple. Tell me about yourself." Jack hesitated. He wasn't used to this. People usually didn't ask. But Eric just waited, patient, unbothered by the silence. "I used to work at a factory," Jack finally said. "Good job, steady pay. But then they shut down and, well, you know how it goes." Eric nodded. "I do. But tell me more. What are you good at? What do you like to do?" Jack frowned. He hadn't thought about that in a long time. Surviving day to day didn't leave much room for hobbies or dreams. "I worked with machines. Hands-on stuff. Always liked fixing things." Eric made a note. "That's good. We've got a job training program here. A few workshops, some connections to companies looking for workers. It's not a quick fix, but it's a start." Jack nodded, gripping the arms of the chair. This was happening. It felt overwhelming, but in a way that wasn't entirely bad. "You've got someone looking out for you," Eric added, glancing up. "Most people don't have someone like Karoline Leavitt stepping in to help." Jack exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't get it," he admitted. "Why did she help? Why me?" Eric smiled slightly. "Sometimes people just do the right thing. No strings attached. She's known for standing up for what she believes in. Maybe she just saw someone worth helping." Jack let the words settle inside him. Worth helping. It had been a long time since he had thought of himself that way. As the meeting wrapped up, Eric handed him a small folder with resources, places to apply for work, programs he could join, next steps that could actually lead somewhere. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was something. A direction. Jack spent the next few days settling into a routine. Meals at the shelter, job applications, meetings with the staff. Every time he felt himself hesitating, he thought about Karoline's words. "If I help you today, you have to help yourself tomorrow." And then something happened that he never saw coming. One evening, just after dinner, the shelter's TV was turned to the news. He wasn't paying attention at first, too busy organizing the few belongings he had. But then he heard a name that made his entire body freeze. Karoline Leavitt. His head snapped up. The screen showed a news anchor discussing a viral video, one that had exploded across social media overnight. His stomach twisted as the footage played. A shaky phone recording of his encounter with Karoline on the street, their conversation, the moment she handed him the $100 bill, the way she crouched down to his level, like he mattered. The shelter grew silent as more people turned toward the screen. Ack's pulse quickened as he watched the footage play out on the screen. The clip showed every detail, the moment Karoline stopped, the way she crouched down, the way she listened. It wasn't just the money. It was the way she treated him, like he was someone worth talking to, someone worth helping. The news anchor's voice filled the shelter. The video of Karoline Leavitt's interaction with a homeless man has now gone viral, sparking conversations nationwide. Many are praising her act of kindness, calling it a reminder of the power of small gestures. Others argue it highlights a deeper issue, questioning why it takes a public figure's involvement for people to notice the struggles of the homeless community. Jack swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the attention pressing down on him. He had spent so much time trying to stay unseen, avoiding stares, avoiding pity. Now his face was on every screen, his lowest moment broadcasted for millions to see. He looked around the shelter, noticing that others were watching too. Some of them nodded, some whispered to each other. A few smiled at him, as if silently acknowledging that they had seen the video and now saw him differently. Eric, the caseworker, sat down beside him. "How do you feel about all this?" he asked, his tone calm, steady. Jack exhaled, rubbing his face. "I don't know. It's strange. I didn't ask for this. I didn't expect this." Eric nodded. "No one ever does. But sometimes things happen for a reason. This could be an opportunity, Jack." "An opportunity for what?" Jack asked, his voice low. "To start fresh," Eric said simply. "People are paying attention now. Doors might open that weren't there before. You just have to decide if you're willing to walk through them." Jack didn't answer right away. His mind was spinning. A week ago, he was just another guy on the street, invisible, ignored. Now people were talking about him, debating his life on TV, sharing his story online. It was overwhelming. But deep down, another thought crept in. maybe this wasn't just about him. Maybe this was bigger than that. The next morning, everything felt different. When Jack stepped outside the shelter, he noticed people looking at him differently. A few even approached him. "Hey man, saw you on the news," one guy said, handing him a cup of coffee. "Hope things turn around for you." Another woman, someone he had seen pass by dozens of times without a glance, actually stopped. "What Karoline did was amazing," she said. "But I hope you know, you deserve this chance." Jack didn't know what to say. He just nodded, muttering a quiet thank you. But the biggest shock came later that afternoon. He had just finished filling out a job application at the shelter when Eric called him over. "You've got a visitor," he said, motioning toward the front desk. Jack frowned. He didn't get visitors. But when he walked to the front, his breath caught in his throat. Karoline Leavitt stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her expression calm but unreadable. "Jack," she said with a small nod. He swallowed hard. "Karoline," he said, his voice uncertain. "Well, what are you doing here?" She exhaled, glancing around before meeting his gaze again. "I wanted to check in on you. See how you were doing." Jack ran a hand over the back of his neck. "Well, I'm here," he said, gesturing toward the shelter. "I went like you said." Karoline gave a small, approving nod. "Good. I knew you would." He let out a small, disbelieving chuckle. "You had more faith in me than I did." She studied him for a moment. Sometimes people just need someone else to believe in them first. Jack didn't know what to say to that. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "I saw the video," he admitted. "Everyone has. It's a lot." Karoline's expression softened slightly. "I know. It wasn't supposed to turn into this big thing. I just saw someone who needed help. That's all it was." Jack exhaled. "So what now?" Karoline tilted her head slightly. "That's up to you." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She reached into her bag, pulling out another card, this one different from the first. "I know someone who runs a program for people looking to get back on their feet," she said. "Not just shelters, but real work opportunities. Second chances. I told him about you. If you're interested, he's willing to help." Jack stared at the card. Another door. Another choice. He could walk away, go back to the life he knew, back to the struggle he had grown used to. Or he could step into something new, something uncertain, something that terrified him as much as it excited him. "You don't have to take it," Karoline said, sensing his hesitation. "But if you do, I think it could change everything." Jack took a deep breath. His fingers curled around the card. "Okay," he said. Karoline smiled. "Okay." Over the next few weeks, Jack took steps he never thought he would. He followed through on Karoline's offer, reaching out to the contact she had given him. The program wasn't easy. It required commitment, showing up on time, proving he was serious. But for the first time in years, Jack had something to work toward. He started with small tasks, helping around the shelter, volunteering where he could. Soon he found himself in a job training program, learning new skills, getting back into a routine. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. And every day, he reminded himself of the promise he had made, to Karoline, to himself. Meanwhile, the story of their encounter continued to spread. Donations flooded into shelters across the city. People reached out offering jobs, support, even homes for those in need. It was as if one act of kindness had sparked something bigger than either of them had imagined. One afternoon, months after that cold day on the street, Jack walked into a small coffee shop, a place he used to pass by but never enter. This time, he was there for an interview. He adjusted the collar of the shirt he had been given through the program, ran a hand through his now-trimmed hair, and took a deep breath. He was no longer the man who sat on that street corner. He was someone new. As he waited, the doorbell chimed, and he turned to see Karoline walking in. She spotted him immediately, smiling as she approached. "Look at you," she said, giving him an approving nod. "Told you things could change." Jack chuckled. "Yeah, well, turns out you were right." She sat across from him, studying him for a moment. "How do you feel?" He thought about it, really thought about it. "Like I've got another shot," he said finally. "Like maybe this time, I won't waste it." Karoline nodded. "Good." The interviewer called Jack's name. He stood, smoothing out his shirt, looking back at Karoline one last time. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with something deeper than just gratitude. She smiled. "Just don't forget, now it's your turn to help someone else." Jack gave a small, knowing nod, then turned and walked toward his future. This time, he wasn't alone. This time, he was ready.